Daniel Carter had exactly 30 days left to live. He did not scream when the doctor told him. He did not break down or beg for another opinion. He simply sat in the leather chair across from the desk, folded his hands, and let the words settle over him like snow falling on a quiet street. Instead of choosing treatment, he chose something else entirely. Within a single week, he sold almost everything he owned, severed every relationship that once defined him, and disappeared from the world that had known his name for nearly 2 decades. No one who passed him on the street would have guessed that the man scrubbing dishes in the back of a small roadside diner had once founded a company worth billions of dollars. Then, on a cold and rainy night, everything began to change. A tired waitress glanced at the old watch strapped to his wrist and froze mid-step, her tray nearly slipping from her hands. Something about that watch reached backward through 15 years of her life and pulled at a memory she had never let go of. She had met a man like this once before, a man who had changed the entire direction of her future without ever showing her his face. But this time, the man in front of her had only 30 days left before he would vanish again, this time for good. Daniel Carter was 39 years old when the diagnosis arrived, delivered in a sterile office that smelled faintly of antiseptic and burnt coffee. He was not a husband, and he had no children waiting for him at home, despite what people might have assumed about a man his age, with his kind of quiet, weathered face. He was, above all else, the chairman and founder of Carter Dynamics, a technology and manufacturing empire that employed thousands of people across a dozen countries. His disease was rare, aggressive, and inoperable. A cruel arrangement of cells that had chosen to grow in a place no surgeon could safely reach. The specialist explained the situation with the careful, practiced gentleness of someone who had delivered this kind of news many times before. And somewhere near the end of that explanation, she said the sentence that would follow Daniel for the rest of his life. She told him that the most valuable thing left to him now was no longer money. Daniel did not cry when he heard it. He sat very still, staring at a spot on the wall just above her shoulder, turning the words over slowly in his mind the way a man might turn over a stone to see what lived beneath it. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, almost curious, as though he were asking about a business decision rather than the end of his own existence. He asked her, quite simply, what she would do if she were the one sitting in his chair, with only 30 days left to spend. The doctor did not have a perfect answer, and she admitted as much, but something in the honesty of her uncertainty settled something inside him. Daniel left her office that afternoon and drove for hours without any destination in mind, watching the city lights blur past his window like memories he no longer had the patience to hold on to. By the time he returned to his penthouse that night, he had already made his decision, and he made it with the same clarity and speed that had built his empire in the first place. He would resign from every position he held. He would transfer control of the company to the board he trusted most, and he would give away the overwhelming majority of everything he had earned. He canceled his phone contract the following morning, watching the technician's confused expression as he requested the account be closed entirely rather than simply paused. He deleted every trace of himself from the internet that he could find, scrubbing away photographs, interviews, and the countless articles that had once celebrated him as one of the youngest self-made billionaires in the country. He told no one where he intended to go, not his closest advisors, not the handful of old friends who still occasionally called to check on him, not even the lawyer who had known him since he was 22 years old and hungry with ambition. Daniel wanted, more than anything else in what remained of his life, to be an ordinary man one final time before he disappeared completely. He chose a small coastal town almost at random, drawn by nothing more than a photograph he had once seen of gray waves crashing against a quiet shoreline. It was the kind of place that appeared on very few maps, where the streets rolled gently downhill toward the water, and the air always smelled faintly of salt and rain. Daniel arrived there with a single suitcase, and no plan beyond finding somewhere to sleep, and he walked into the first diner he saw, simply because the warm light spilling from its windows looked like something worth stepping into. The sign above the door read Harbor Lights Diner in faded blue letters, and beneath it, a smaller sign advertised that help was wanted in the kitchen. He asked for the job without hesitation, and the owner, a broad-shouldered man named Walter Higgins, looked him over with the practiced eye of someone who had hired dozens of drifters over the years. Walter saw a man who spoke carefully and moved with quiet purpose. Someone who seemed to be carrying something heavy without ever once complaining about the weight of it. He did not ask too many questions, because in a town like this, questions were rarely welcome and even less rarely answered. Daniel began working that same week, washing dishes at first, then mopping floors, then helping in the kitchen whenever an extra pair of hands was needed, and eventually taking on the quiet work of managing the storeroom no one else wanted to organize. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Daniel found himself doing things with his own two hands, instead of simply directing other people to do them. He learned how to steam milk properly for the coffee machine, burning his fingers twice before he finally got the temperature right. He wiped down the front windows every morning before the sun fully rose, watching his own breath fog against the glass in the cold autumn air. He began speaking with the regular customers who came through the door, listening to their small complaints and smaller joys, the kind of ordinary conversation he had not experienced in nearly 20 years of boardrooms and shareholder meetings. There was a strange, unfamiliar peace that settled into Daniel's chest during those early weeks at the diner, a peace he had never once felt while running a company worth more money than most countries' entire economies. He no longer had to worry about quarterly earnings or hostile takeovers, or the endless demands of people who wanted a piece of what he had built. He simply had to show up, work hard, and go home to the small rented room above the hardware store where he now slept. It was, in its own quiet way, the closest thing to happiness Daniel Carter had experienced since he was a very young man, long before wealth had wrapped itself around his life like a second skin. At night, lying in that narrow rented room with the sound of the harbor wind pressing against the window pane, Daniel often found himself thinking about the man he used to be, the one who wore tailored suits and signed contracts worth more than entire towns like this one. That man felt increasingly distant now, like a character he had once played in a story that belonged to someone else. He did not miss the boardrooms, or the private planes, or the endless stream of people who had once wanted something from him. What he found himself missing, strangely, was something he had never actually possessed in the first place: an ordinary life lived slowly, without an audience watching every move. Among the small staff at Harbor Lights Diner was a waitress named Emily Brooks, 35 years old, with tired eyes that still somehow managed to be kind after years of double shifts and difficult customers. She had worked at the diner for nearly a decade, ever since circumstances had brought her to this town and quietly convinced her to stay. Emily was known throughout the diner for her patience, the kind that seemed almost impossible to shake even on the hardest days, and for a resilience that the other staff members admired, without ever fully understanding where it came from. She worked nearly every shift the schedule allowed, arriving before sunrise, and often staying long after the last customer had gone home. From the very first week Daniel began working there, Emily found herself glancing at him more often than she meant to, drawn by something she could not quite name or explain. There was a familiarity in the way he carried himself, in the particular tilt of his head when he listened to someone speak, that tugged at a memory buried somewhere deep in the back of her mind. She would catch herself staring at him across the kitchen, and then quickly looking away, embarrassed by an instinct she could not justify with any real evidence. Whenever their eyes happened to meet, Daniel would look away almost immediately, a habit Emily noticed, but chose not to question, assuming it was simply shyness or the natural reserve of a man who kept mostly to himself. Daniel, for his part, was doing everything he could to avoid being truly seen by anyone, least of all, a sharp and observant woman like Emily Brooks. He had spent years being recognized in every restaurant, every airport, every charity gala across the country. And the last thing he wanted now was for someone to look too closely and realize who he had once been. He kept his answers short whenever Emily asked him simple, friendly questions about where he had come from or what had brought him to this particular town. He told himself that his secret was safe, that no one in a place this small and forgotten would ever connect a dishwasher with faded jeans to a man whose face had once graced the covers of business magazines. But something about him continued to nag at Emily, in the quiet hours of her shifts, in the moments between orders, when her mind was free to wander. She would find herself thinking about him while walking home in the evenings, turning the mystery over and over the way one might worry a loose thread on a favorite sweater. There was history between them somehow. She was almost certain of it, though she could not have said what kind of history or from what point in her life it might have come. The question sat with her like an unfinished sentence, refusing to let her rest until she finally understood what it meant. 15 years earlier, long before Emily Brooks ever set foot inside Harbor Lights Diner, she had been a struggling college student with almost nothing to her name. Her mother had fallen seriously ill that winter, and the medical bills had arrived faster than Emily could ever hope to pay them, stacking up on the kitchen table like a debt that grew heavier every single day. She had been forced to consider dropping out of school entirely, since there was simply no way to afford both her mother's treatment and her own tuition at the same time. Emily remembered those months as some of the darkest of her entire life, filled with sleepless nights, spent doing math in her head that never once came out in her favor. Then, without warning or explanation, something extraordinary happened. Her tuition balance was paid in full by an anonymous source the university refused to identify. Her mother's hospital bills were quietly settled the following week, and a letter soon arrived, offering Emily a part-time position that fit perfectly around her class schedule, one that paid enough to keep both of them afloat. The only trace of the person responsible was a single set of initials scrawled at the bottom of a receipt Emily had kept folded in her wallet ever since. 2 simple letters that had never once left her side across 15 long years. Those initials read D.C. Nothing more, no full name, no return address, no way to trace the kindness back to its source. Emily had never actually seen the man's face, since every arrangement had been handled through lawyers and intermediaries who refused to reveal anything about their client. She had tried, in the years that followed, to imagine what kind of person would do something so generous and then disappear so completely, asking for nothing in return. She built an idea of him in her mind, a quiet stranger who had somehow decided her life was worth saving. And she carried that idea with her, the way some people carry faith. The receipt itself had become something sacred to Emily over the years, tucked carefully into the back pocket of an old wallet she never fully retired, even after buying a newer one. She would sometimes take it out on difficult nights and simply look at those 2 letters, drawing a strange kind of comfort from a stranger's handwriting. What Emily could not have known, standing in the kitchen of Harbor Lights Diner all these years later, was that the very man behind those initials was now washing dishes only a few feet away from her. Daniel had no memory of the specific transaction that changed her life, since he had quietly funded dozens of similar scholarships and medical bills over the years, without ever tracking the names attached to them. Emily Brooks was that girl from 15 years ago, and neither of them yet understood how closely their 2 stories had already been woven together. As the weeks passed at the diner, Daniel became something of a quiet fixture in the daily rhythm of the small establishment, the kind of presence people came to rely on without ever fully noticing they had come to depend on him. He fixed the temperamental coffee machine one morning after it had been broken for nearly a month, tightening a loose wire that none of the previous repairmen had ever bothered to check. He rewired a section of the diner's faulty electrical system after the lights began flickering during the dinner rush, working late into the night without asking for a single extra dollar. When the first heavy snow of the season arrived, he was outside before sunrise clearing the sidewalk in front of the diner so elderly customers would not slip on their way inside. He never once accepted credit for any of these small acts of kindness, brushing off gratitude with a shrug or a quiet change of subject whenever someone tried to thank him properly. The customers who visited Harbor Lights Diner regularly began to speak about him fondly among themselves. The quiet man in the back, who somehow made the whole place feel warmer than it used to. One elderly regular, a retired school teacher named Frank Doyle, who had eaten breakfast at the same corner booth for 11 years, told Daniel one morning that he had turned this old diner into something that felt like a family again. Daniel simply smiled at the comment and returned to wiping down the counter, though something in his chest tightened at the weight of those simple words. In the quiet moments when no one else was watching, Daniel allowed himself to feel the full truth of his situation, settling over him like an unwelcome guest that refused to leave. He knew, with the same certainty that had once guided every major decision of his business career, that his time in this small town was rapidly running out. Each sunrise now carried a particular kind of sharpness to it, a beauty he had never noticed before, because he had never before understood exactly how few of them remained. He found himself lingering a little longer over small things: the smell of fresh coffee, the sound of rain against the diner's windows, the easy laughter of strangers who had somehow, without meaning to, become something like friends. The night everything changed arrived without any warning at all, disguised as nothing more than another ordinary evening shift. A heavy autumn storm had rolled in from the coast that afternoon, rattling the windows of the diner and sending most customers scrambling home before the worst of the rain arrived. Daniel had rolled up his sleeves to help clear a backlog of dishes piling up in the kitchen sink, moving quickly through the familiar motions his hands had come to know so well over the past several weeks. It was in that ordinary, unremarkable moment, with soap suds still clinging to his wrists, that Emily happened to glance over and finally see what had been hiding beneath his sleeve the entire time. An old watch sat fastened around his wrist, its leather band worn soft with age, its face slightly scratched from years of careful, constant use. Something about it struck Emily immediately, a jolt of recognition so sudden and so physical that she had to grip the edge of the counter to steady herself. It was, impossibly, achingly similar to a watch she remembered from a story her mother used to tell. A story about the kind stranger whose gift had once saved both their lives. Emily found herself unable to look away, her breath catching somewhere high in her throat, as old memories rushed forward all at once. She waited until Daniel set down the dishes and stepped away from the sink before she found the courage to approach him. Her heart pounding so loudly, she was certain he must be able to hear it. She asked, as casually as she could manage, whether she might take a closer look at his watch, and something in her voice must have carried more weight than she intended, because Daniel hesitated before finally holding out his wrist. Emily turned the watch gently in her fingers, examining the worn leather and the small scratches along its edge, before carefully unclasping it to look at the inner side of the band. There, engraved in small, careful letters that had faded slightly with time, were 3 words that made the entire world around her seem to tilt on its axis. The engraving read, "Never stop believing." The exact phrase Emily's mother had once told her was written on a note tucked inside the very first envelope containing their salvation 15 years earlier. Emily's hands began to tremble so badly that she nearly dropped the watch entirely, and she had to set it down carefully on the counter before her fingers lost their grip completely. She looked up at Daniel with an expression he could not quite interpret, somewhere between disbelief and desperate hope, her eyes searching his face for an answer he did not yet know she was asking for. She whispered, almost to herself, that it could not possibly be true, that the odds of such a thing happening were simply too impossible to accept. That night, long after her shift had ended, Emily sat alone in her small apartment with her old wallet open on the kitchen table, the faded receipt with its 2 initials laid out beside her laptop. She spent hours searching, piecing together fragments of information with the same determination she had once used to survive her mother's illness all those years ago. Slowly, carefully, the picture began to take shape in front of her, though it was almost too extraordinary to believe even as the evidence accumulated. Daniel Carter, founder and former chairman of Carter Dynamics, had vanished from public life several months earlier, without any official explanation offered to the press or to his own company's shareholders. Every article, Emily found, painted the same confusing picture, describing a wealthy, driven businessman who had simply disappeared, leaving behind a company suddenly without its most visible leader. There were no reports of scandal, no hint of financial trouble, nothing that would normally explain such a sudden and complete withdrawal from a life he had spent decades building. Emily found an old photograph from a charity gala several years earlier, and there, despite the polished suit and the confident smile so different from the quiet man she knew at the diner, was unmistakably the same face. She sat back in her chair, staring at the screen for a long time, trying to reconcile the billionaire in the photograph with the man who had spent the last month washing dishes beside her. The following morning, Emily arrived at the diner earlier than usual, finding Daniel alone in the kitchen preparing for the breakfast rush. She did not waste time with small talk, walking directly up to him and asking, in a voice that shook only slightly, why a man like him was hiding in a place like this. Daniel's shoulders tensed for a moment, and then, slowly, something in his posture seemed to release, as though he had been waiting a long time for someone to finally ask him that exact question. He offered her a small, tired smile, before answering simply that he wanted, more than anything else, to experience what it felt like to live as an ordinary person one final time. Emily did not fully understand what he meant by that phrase, one final time, but something in the way he said it sent a cold, uneasy feeling spreading through her chest. She pressed him further, and eventually, reluctantly, Daniel told her the truth about the diagnosis that had brought him to this small coastal town in the first place. He explained the rare cancer, the doctors who could offer no surgical solution, the calendar that had shrunk from decades down to a single, brutal month. Emily felt the floor seem to shift beneath her feet as she listened, the weight of his words landing with a force she had not been prepared for. She confirmed the medical details later that same week, quietly reaching out to a contact who worked in hospital records and could verify what Daniel had told her without revealing his identity to anyone else. The file was there, precise and unforgiving in its clinical language, confirming that Daniel Carter had perhaps 30 days remaining before his condition would become fatal. Emily sat with that knowledge for a long time, feeling the strange, painful irony of it all settling over her like a physical weight. The man who had once saved her entire future without ever asking for anything in return was now dying quietly in the back of a diner, completely unknown to the world that had once celebrated him. That evening, when Emily finally confronted Daniel with everything she now understood, tears fell freely down her cheeks even as she tried to hold herself together. Daniel, for his part, remained remarkably calm, watching her cry with an expression that held more compassion than fear. He told her gently that he did not want anyone's pity. That pity was the one thing he had specifically come here to escape from. He explained that all he wanted, in the time that remained to him, was a few final weeks in which he could simply be remembered as a human being, rather than as a name attached to a fortune. Something shifted between them after that conversation, a closeness that neither of them had expected but that both seemed to welcome without hesitation. They began spending their limited free time together, walking slowly along the rocky shoreline as the tide pulled in and out beneath a gray autumn sky. They shared quiet cups of coffee at a small table near the window, watching the world move past outside while they talked about everything and nothing at all. They stood together some evenings watching the sun disappear behind the water, saying very little, content simply to share the silence between them. There was no rush between Daniel and Emily, no desperate grasping at romance in the shadow of a ticking clock, only a deep and unhurried sense of recognition. They spoke about things neither of them had ever told another living soul, old regrets, quiet fears, small dreams that had been set aside and nearly forgotten over the years. Emily told him about her mother, who had passed away peacefully several years earlier, and how she had spent the rest of her life wondering about the stranger who had once saved them both. Daniel listened to every word with a stillness that told her he was truly hearing her, not simply waiting for his turn to speak. He, in turn, told her about the early years of building Carter Dynamics from nothing more than a small workshop and a stubborn refusal to give up, about the loneliness that had crept in as the company grew larger than he ever intended it to become. He admitted, quietly one evening as they sat on a weathered bench overlooking the harbor, that he had forgotten what real connection felt like somewhere along the way. Emily reached over and took his hand without saying anything at all, and Daniel let her, allowing himself, for the first time in longer than he could remember, to simply be comforted rather than admired. Their bond deepened, not through grand romantic gestures but through the quiet accumulation of shared moments, the kind that mattered far more than anything money could ever purchase. Daniel found himself looking forward to Emily's shifts more than he cared to admit, counting the hours until he would see her familiar face walk through the diner's front door. Emily, for her part, found herself falling into something she had not expected to feel again, a tenderness that arrived, not despite Daniel's circumstances but somehow because of the honesty those circumstances had forced between them. Neither of them spoke openly about what this connection meant, content instead to let it exist quietly in the space between them, undefined and unhurried. But Emily was not a woman who accepted impossible situations without a fight. Not after everything she had already survived in her own life. Late one night, unable to sleep, she began making calls, reaching out to every medical contact she had accumulated over the years, working in a town that saw its fair share of difficult diagnoses. She contacted a former physician who had once treated her mother, a man who still owed her a debt of gratitude for her patience during a particularly difficult year of treatment. Through him, she was introduced to a research team working on an experimental protocol that had only recently received approval for a very narrow category of rare cancer cases. The treatment was new, unproven on a large scale, and offered no guarantees, but early trial results had shown genuine promise in cases remarkably similar to Daniel's own diagnosis. Emily spent days gathering information, speaking with specialists, and building a case she hoped might convince Daniel to reconsider the fate he had already accepted for himself. When she finally brought the proposal to him, laying out every detail with the same careful determination she had once used to survive her own crisis 15 years earlier, Daniel's first instinct was to refuse. He told her plainly that he did not want false hope, that he had already made peace with his ending and did not wish to disturb that fragile peace now. Emily refused to accept his answer so easily, standing her ground in a way that surprised even herself. She reminded him, her voice steady despite the emotion behind it, that many years ago he had reached into her life and given her a future she never thought she would have. She told him that it was now her turn to try to do the same for him, that she was not asking him to hope blindly, only to allow her the chance to try. Daniel looked at her for a long moment, searching her face for the same quiet certainty he remembered from his own younger years, back when he still believed the impossible could sometimes be persuaded to bend. Something in her conviction finally broke through the wall he had built so carefully around his own acceptance of death. After several more days of quiet conversation, of long walks along the shoreline, where they weighed every possible outcome together, Daniel finally agreed to let the doctors try. The decision was not made lightly, and it was not made out of desperation, but rather out of a growing recognition that Emily's belief in him deserved, at the very least, the honesty of an attempt. Arrangements were made quickly, discreetly, with Daniel entering the experimental program under conditions that protected the privacy he had worked so hard to secure. The treatment itself was demanding, requiring Daniel to spend long stretches away from the diner and the small life he had built for himself in that quiet coastal town. Emily visited whenever her shifts allowed, sitting beside his hospital bed with the same steady patience she had brought to every difficult moment in her own life. There were days when the treatment left him weak and exhausted, when doubt crept back in, and he wondered whether he had made the right choice in disturbing the peace he had already found. Emily never allowed that doubt to take root for long, reminding him gently, again and again, that giving up was never something either of them had been particularly good at. The weeks that followed tested both of them in ways neither had fully anticipated, filled with uncertain test results and the exhausting rhythm of hope rising and falling in equal measure. Daniel's body responded slowly at first, showing no clear signs in either direction, leaving the medical team cautiously watching rather than celebrating. Emily continued working her shifts at the diner even as her mind remained constantly with him, and the other staff members, sensing something significant was happening, quietly rallied around her without asking too many questions. Walter Higgins, the diner's gruff but good-hearted owner, adjusted her schedule without complaint whenever she needed extra time at the hospital, never once mentioning the cost to himself. There were nights during that difficult stretch when Emily sat alone in the hospital waiting room, long after visiting hours had technically ended, refusing to leave until a nurse gently reminded her that Daniel needed his rest more than her company. She would drive home through empty streets with the radio off, replaying every conversation they had shared since the night she first noticed his watch, searching for some sign she might have missed. Daniel, on the harder days, sometimes asked her quietly whether she regretted convincing him to try, whether the uncertainty was worse than the peace he had already made with dying. Emily always answered the same way, telling him that uncertainty paired with hope was still infinitely better than certainty paired with none at all. And slowly, he began to believe her. Exactly 1 month after the treatment began, the same span of time the original doctors had once told Daniel he had left to live, he woke early one morning to the sound of hushed, Hopeful voices outside his hospital room door. The lead physician entered, carrying a folder of test results, her expression carefully neutral in the practiced way of someone who had learned not to promise too much before the data was fully understood. She explained that the tumor had responded far more positively than anyone on the research team had dared to expect, shrinking to a size that opened new possibilities no one had considered realistic just weeks earlier. She was careful with her words, telling Daniel and Emily, who sat gripping his hand tightly beside the bed, that this could not yet be called a miracle in any official medical sense. But she added, with the first genuine smile either of them had seen from her in weeks, that Daniel now had considerably more time ahead of him than the 30 days he had once been told to prepare for. The room fell silent for a long moment as the weight of that sentence settled over both of them, neither quite able to find the words that felt adequate for what they were feeling. Emily finally broke the silence with a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a sob, pressing her forehead gently against the back of Daniel's hand. When Daniel finally returned to Harbor Lights Diner several weeks later, still recovering but visibly stronger than he had been in months, the entire staff erupted into spontaneous applause the moment he walked through the door. Walter Higgins crossed the room in 3 quick strides and pulled him into a rough, wordless embrace that said more than any speech could have managed. Frank Doyle, still seated in his usual corner booth, raised his coffee cup in a small, silent toast, his eyes suspiciously bright behind his glasses. Emily stood near the counter, watching it all unfold, a quiet smile spreading across her face as she finally allowed herself to believe that this moment was real. Daniel did not return to the life of a billionaire chairman he had once lived, and he had no intention of ever doing so again. Not after everything the past several months had taught him about what actually mattered. He chose instead to embrace a slower, quieter version of existence, one built around the small, meaningful connections he had discovered in this town he had originally intended only to pass through. He used a portion of his remaining fortune to establish a foundation dedicated to funding research into rare and difficult-to-treat cancers, ensuring that other patients might someday have access to the same experimental hope that had saved his own life. He also created a scholarship program modeled directly on the anonymous gift that had once changed Emily's future, this time choosing to remain openly involved rather than hiding behind a set of initials. He continued showing up at Harbor Lights Diner nearly every single morning, no longer as an employee escaping his past, but simply as a man who had come to genuinely love the small, ordinary rhythm of that particular life. He still poured coffee for the regulars sometimes, still wiped down the front windows before the sun fully rose, though now everyone in town knew exactly who he was and loved him anyway. The story of the vanished billionaire who had found his way back to life inside a small coastal diner eventually made its way into the local newspaper, though Daniel insisted the article focus far more on the diner itself than on him. A full year passed, marked by the slow, steady accumulation of small joys that Daniel had once believed were beneath his notice. Back when his life had been measured only in numbers and headlines, Harbor Lights Diner had grown busier than ever. Its booths filled most mornings with both longtime regulars and curious newcomers drawn by the story that had quietly spread throughout the region. A small wooden sign now hung near the entrance, carved by Frank Doyle himself as a gift, bearing a simple sentence that Daniel had once said to Emily on one of their early evening walks along the shore. It read that sometimes the greatest fortunes were measured not in dollars but in second chances, and beneath it, smaller letters noted that it was dedicated to everyone who still believed in beginning again. On a quiet afternoon, that first anniversary of his return, Daniel sat beside Emily in their usual booth near the window, watching the season's first true rain of autumn streak down the glass in slow, winding paths. Neither of them spoke for a long while, content simply to exist together in the comfortable silence that had come to define so much of their relationship since that stormy night when she had first noticed his watch. No one walking through the diner's doors that day paid any particular attention to the man in the window booth, no longer curious about how much money he once had or how far he had once fallen from public view. What mattered now, to Daniel, and to everyone who had come to know him in this small, forgotten town, was simply that he was still there, still breathing, still grateful for every ordinary morning that continued, against all odds, to arrive. Emily reached across the table and took his hand the way she had done so many times before. And Daniel turned his wrist slightly, so the old worn watch caught the gray afternoon light from the window. The words engraved along its inner band had grown even fainter over the years, but neither of them needed to read them anymore to remember what they said. Never Stop Believing had carried Emily through the darkest year of her young life, 15 years earlier, and it had carried Daniel back from the very edge of his own ending more recently than either of them liked to dwell on. It seemed fitting, somehow, that the same three words had quietly shaped both of their lives so completely, long before either of them understood how deeply their two stories had always been connected. Outside, the rain continued to fall steadily over the small harbor town, tapping gently against the windows of the diner that had once given a dying stranger a place to disappear, and had instead given him a reason to stay. Inside, the warmth of the kitchen, mixed with the low hum of familiar conversation, the clatter of dishes, the occasional burst of laughter from Frank Doyle's corner booth, all of it forming the quiet, ordinary music of a life Daniel Carter had once thought he would never be allowed to keep. He had come to this town intending only to vanish, to spend his final days as no one in particular, free from the weight of everything he had built and lost interest in along the way. Instead, he had found something he never expected to find again. A version of himself worth staying alive for, and a woman whose life had been quietly tied to his own, long before either of them ever knew the other existed. As the afternoon light began to soften toward evening, Emily rose to refill a coffee pot for a table near the door, and Daniel watched her go with the same quiet contentment that had become so familiar to him over the past year. He thought, not for the first time, about how strange and generous life could be when a person finally stopped trying to control every part of it. He had once measured his worth in acquisitions and quarterly profits, convinced that success meant building something enormous enough to outlast him. Now he understood that the truest measure of a life well lived was far simpler than that, found instead in second chances offered and accepted, in ordinary mornings shared with people who mattered, and in a single quiet diner by the sea, where a dying man had somehow, against every expectation, learned how to live again,